Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Poterba, the current president of the NBER, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the session that marks the 100th anniversary of the NBER. And in fact, it is really the AEA meeting that should be credited as the birthplace for the NBER, because it was at the December 1919 AEA meeting, which was held in Chicago between Christmas and New Year's, that a small group of economists gathered to plan what would become the NBER and to sign the request for the state of New York to set up a nonprofit corporation that would be directed to study questions in economic research with a particular focus at that point on understanding the distribution of national income between labor and capital. The founding story of the NBER, which I will not belabor this afternoon, features two important researchers. One, Malcolm Rorty, who was then the chief statistician at AT&T, one of the largest US companies, who wrote a business newsletter tracking, amongst other things, developments in the left-leaning socialist camp in the United States. The other is Nachum Stone, a PhD in economics from Columbia, who was a labor organizer as well as a labor economist, had translated part of Das Kapital into English as part of his dissertation research. And as you could imagine, these two individuals were not necessarily aligned on how they thought about a lot of policy issues. They had, however, served together on a number of commissions in the 1910s in the New York City and New York State that were addressing questions like, should there be a minimum wage, should there be maximum hours legislation? And they realized that they didn't have data to address the questions they were being asked to answer, and that there was a real need for some organization to bring together the powers of data collection and data analysis to be able to set out the facts that were needed for careful and dispositive analysis of policy issues. That was the origin of creating something like the NBER, with which some foundation support from the Carnegies and the Rochesters and the Rockefellers was able to launch in 1920. The initial project was one that focused on measuring national income and trying to assess the factor shares. The vision that Wesley Clair Mitchell, the first director of research, had as he moved this project forward was that the NBER would be bigger than anything that any one researcher could do, that by bringing together a team of researchers and arming them with a group of research assistants, the NBER would be able to carry out bigger projects than economics had done before. This was kind of a post-World War I, we should think on a bigger scale kind of mentality that was being embraced as part of the founding story. And the NBER, in fact, did things which even today sound like a great idea. There were two teams, two tracks that were trying to measure national income, one doing it on the product side, one doing it on the income side. And then they had this moment when they brought the two sides together and discovered that no entry differed by more than 7%. And they were delighted to discover they thought this had actually worked, that they'd done a reasonable job of managing to measure the key aggregates. So over time, the NBER moved from focusing on national income to thinking about labor market dynamics, to thinking about business cycles, which was a key interest of Mitchell's and then later his student Burns, to thinking about the measurement of national income accounts. And when Simon Kuznets, who was also a student of Mitchell's, joined the NBER in the late 1920s, then was seconded to the Commerce Department in the early 1930s, he played a central role, of course, not just in designing the accounts, but then implementing them in the US context. The NBER has, in its first 50 years, carried out a whole set of major research projects by a relatively small research staff. In its second 50 years, principally as a result of the really reorganization of the NBER by Marty Feldstein, who became president in 1977, the NBER became more of a network organization which supported a much larger fraction of the economics profession, bringing together much more research, but carrying out fewer centrally directed projects with a core staff of on payroll research economists. This afternoon, we are going to celebrate some of the research themes on which NBER research has played a particularly important role in advancing the research frontier over the last century. And those will be in the spirit of business cycle analysis, in measuring national income, in thinking about human capital, and in looking at the measurement and in looking at questions around monetary policy. So there are many other topics on which we could imagine having a longer session, but the exigencies of these meetings and your attention span for the day confine us to thinking about these four. But these are four of the most important, and of course there are many others that one could think about.